They told us history began elsewhere, but we know better now. We've walked through the truth they buried. We've heard the whispers beneath the silence, and we've stood face to face with a legacy too powerful to be forgotten. Africa didn't borrow civilization. Africa authored it. From the cradle of life to the height of empires, from the first written word to the earliest star charts, from kings crowned in gold to scholars draped in wisdom, Africa has always been the origin, not the outsider. Loudspeaker, don't let this truth stay hidden. Hit like so more people can see it. Subscribe so you never miss what they tried to erase. And share this with someone who's ready to unlearn, relearn, and remember. Because these stories aren't just Black history, they're human history. And together, we're reclaiming the narrative. What if everything you thought you knew about history was just the edited version? What if your introduction to civilization didn't begin with the familiar faces of Caesar, Socrates, or Napoleon, but with kings and queens who reigned from African thrones long before Europe's first brick was laid? Not just Egypt, not just the pyramids, but the entire truth, the rich, complex, often forgotten truth about the African continent. Because here's the real history. Africa is not where the world ended up. It's where the world began. But for generations, you were told otherwise. You were taught to see Africa through a lens of lack, as a continent that only entered history when it was discovered, as a place defined by slavery, colonization, and struggle, as though nothing important ever happened there before European boots hit the shore. But what if that story was never true? What if that version of history wasn't just incomplete, but deliberately rewritten? Because the truth is, history was hijacked. Colonizers didn't just take gold, land, and people. They took narrative control. They erased timelines. They buried achievements. They redefined greatness on their own terms. For colonial empires to justify their dominance, they needed the world to believe that Africa had no meaningful past, that its people were blank slates, waiting to be civilized. So they told that story, repeated it in classrooms, printed it in books, carved it into policy, and the world believed it. But today, the blindfold comes off, because the truth isn't just different, it's awe-inspiring. Africa wasn't waiting for civilization. Africa was civilization. It birthed math before Greece, built cities before Rome, wrote philosophies before the Enlightenment. And in this documentary, we're unearthing what was buried. Some of these truths will inspire you. Others will sting. But they all matter. So if you ever felt the tug of a deeper history, the whisper that something's missing from what you were taught, you're right. This is the story they never wanted told. And it starts in the place where life itself began, Africa. Africa, the word alone carries weight, often misunderstood, misrepresented, misnamed, but it's more than a continent. It's the foundation beneath all of us. When scientists trace the human genome, all paths lead back here. Every man, woman, and child walking the earth today shares a common ancestor who lived on this continent. Whether you're in Beijing or Brooklyn, Berlin, or Bogota, your story begins in Africa. It's one of the most important truths in all of science. And yet, it's rarely taught as the powerful beginning it is. Why? Because once you admit Africa is where humanity began, you must also accept that it's where greatness began. That logic, creativity, spirituality, and society didn't migrate to Africa. They were born there. And here's the proof. Deep in the Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers uncovered a small artifact, a piece of ochre marked with deliberate crosshatch patterns. It's over 75,000 years old, the oldest evidence of symbolic thinking ever found, older than cave art in France, older than any known writing. These weren't random scratches. They were intentional, cognitive, human. Even further north, in the Lebombo Mountains near the border of South Africa and Swaziland, lies the Lebombo bone, a baboon's fibula with 29 carved notches. Dated to roughly 43,000 years ago, it is widely considered one of the earliest mathematical tools in history, long before Euclid, before Pythagoras, before the Greeks etched geometry into the walls of the academy. Africans were counting, recording, and measuring the world around them. Another extraordinary artifact, the Ishango bone, was discovered near the headwaters of the Nile in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's more than 20,000 years old and contains patterns that suggest multiplication and division. Some scholars believe it was used to track lunar phases, hinting at early timekeeping in astronomy. Let that settle in. Africans were performing basic algebra before the concept of an alphabet even existed. But these discoveries are often kept out of mainstream history books, locked away in European museums, regarded as curiosities, not as core evidence of human intellectual development. Because to elevate these artifacts is to challenge a system built on the idea that progress traveled from west to east, from Europe to Africa, not the other way around. But the evidence is clear. Africa was calculating when others were still wandering. And it wasn't just numbers. In places like Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, before the pyramids, before even Stonehenge, ancient Africans constructed a massive megalithic calendar that aligned with the stars. They tracked solstices. They studied the sky. They built with purpose. These weren't random rock formations. They were intentional astronomical observatories, engineered with knowledge and precision. So why isn't Nabta Playa mentioned in every high school history class? Because to include it would be to admit that long before European astronomy existed, Africans were already studying the cosmos. This isn't about inflating history. It's about finally acknowledging it. Africa gave birth to humankind. But more than that, it birthed intellect. It birthed pattern recognition. It birthed a way of understanding the world through logic, abstraction, and observation. So the next time someone says Africa had no history before colonization, ask them this. How can the place that birthed the human mind ever be considered empty? Because the deeper truth is this. Africa wasn't just the cradle of humanity. It was the classroom of civilization. Long before there were cathedrals in Europe, before the Sistine Chapel ever saw a drop of paint, before Da Vinci, Michelangelo, or Van Gogh, Africa was already telling its stories in color, not with just words, but with brush, stone, movement, and spirit. Across the vast southern deserts and northern mountains of the continent, humans left behind not just survival records, but art, evidence of creativity, of imagination, of emotion. In the ancient caves of Namibia, paintings more than 20,000 years old decorate the rocks. These are not crude markings. They're intricate depictions of animals, dances, and ceremonial life, detailed and layered, speaking of spiritual depth and aesthetic vision. In Algeria's Tassili Niger, thousands of petroglyphs stretch across miles of sandstone. Scenes of hunters with bows, women dancing in celebration, pastoralists guiding herds across a green Sahara. Yes, green. These paintings were made when the Sahara was lush and fertile, long before it became desert. The art itself is a living memory of a different climate, a different world. These cave galleries predate the empires of Greece and Rome by millennia. They don't just display beauty. They encode knowledge of migration, ecology, and social structure. But ask yourself, when was the last time you saw this art in a textbook? When were these expressions celebrated alongside the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's David? Too often, African art is described as tribal or primitive. But that language isn't just inaccurate. It's erasure. Because these works show more than survival. They show introspection, ritual, ceremony, and abstraction. They are not decorations. They are declarations. We were here. We understood. We created. And this artistry didn't vanish. It evolved. From the bronze sculptures of Ife to the Benin bronzes, sophisticated metalworks that shocked Europeans with their craftsmanship, to the woven fabrics of the Ashanti, the architectural geometry of the Dogon, and the sculptural mastery of Nok terracotta statues, African art continued to innovate for thousands of years. It was deeply tied to cosmology, governance, and identity. In many African societies, art was not separated from life. It was life. Masks guided spiritual rites. Carvings encoded law and ancestry. Textiles bore messages, not just patterns. But colonial anthropologists viewed these expressions through the wrong lens. They labeled them artifacts instead of art, curios instead of culture. Entire collections were looted and shipped to European museums, where they were stripped of their stories and context. And back home, generations of African children grew up with no access to the masterpieces their ancestors created. But now, the truth is resurfacing. Africa's art is not lost. It's just been silenced. And as we continue this journey, we will hear from the stones, the pigments, and the symbols, because they speak. They tell us that African civilization was not only logical and scientific, but deeply expressive. And when you combine knowledge with expression, you get culture, you get civilization, you get Africa. Now that we peel back the layers of early African intellect, science, and art, what happens when we look at power? What happens when we examine the political, economic, and military might of African civilizations? Here's the truth. While Europe was stumbling through plagues, feudal wars, and a centuries-long dark age, Africa was rising. Empires were thriving. Gold flowed through cities that sparkle with culture, scholarship, and trade. So why doesn't every history book start here? Let's begin with Mali, a West African empire that stretched across modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and parts of Niger and Burkina Faso. By the 13th century, Mali wasn't just large. It was wealthy, and at its helm stood one of the most legendary rulers in world history, Mansa Musa. His name is often left out of classroom lessons, but his legacy is monumental. Ruling from 1312 to 1337, Mansa Musa controlled the gold trade in a region that held more than half of the world's known reserves. His empire's riches were so vast that when he embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, his caravan reportedly stretched for miles, carrying tens of thousands of people and so much gold that he collapsed economies along the way just by giving it away. Imagine that, a black African emperor who made the global economy tremble with his generosity. When he passed through Cairo, eyewitnesses recorded his splendor in stunned detail. Gold-dusted robes, camels draped in silk, attendants handing out coins like candy. Yet, somehow, his name is absent from most mainstream history syllabi. Why? Because to teach Mansa Musa is to teach that wealth, power, and global influence once radiated from the heart of Africa, not Europe, and that's a narrative colonial historians weren't ready to embrace. But the empire wasn't just about money. Mali was a center of learning. In the city of Timbuktu, scholars gathered in mosques and libraries to study astronomy, medicine, law, theology, and philosophy. The University of Sankore attracted intellectuals from across the Islamic world. Manuscripts, tens of thousands of them, were copied and preserved, some still hidden today in private Malian collections. While Oxford and Cambridge were still in their infancy, Timbuktu was a beacon of scholarly pursuit. Let that sink in. And Mali wasn't alone. Further east, the kingdom of Aksum, based in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, had already emerged as one of the great empires of the ancient world. Rising to power around the 1st century CE, Aksum boasted a written script, a coin-based economy, and massive granite obelisks that tower above the earth to this day. It was also one of the earliest states in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion, long before most of Europe had even heard the gospel. Aksum traded with India, Rome, and the Byzantine Empire. Its ships carried goods across the Red Sea. Its influence stretched far beyond the Horn of Africa. Yet how often do you hear it mentioned in the same breath as Rome or Persia? Aksum was no less advanced, no less organized, no less brilliant, but it wasn't European, so it was erased, just as Carthage, a North African giant, was mischaracterized. Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia, was founded by Phoenicians, but became distinctly African, powered by indigenous innovation and local alliances. Its most famous general, Hannibal, led one of the boldest military campaigns in history, crossing the Alps with war elephants to challenge the mighty Roman Empire, and nearly winning. Carthage was a naval power, a trade hub, and a cultural force. But because Rome eventually conquered it, Roman historians wrote the story. And in their version, Carthage was a barbaric obstacle, not a thriving African civilization. And then there's perhaps the most controversial jewel of African legacy, Great Zimbabwe. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, this massive stone city in southern Africa featured granite walls, so precisely fitted they needed no mortar. Towers, enclosures, and a massive royal complex were constructed with mathematical precision. At its height, Great Zimbabwe was a bustling capital that connected African goods to global markets. Archaeologists have uncovered Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, and Arab coins on site. And yet, When European colonists encountered the ruins, they couldn't believe Africans had built them. They refused to. Theories sprouted. Phoenicians, Arabs, even lost tribes of Israel. Anything but the truth. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall Maciver confirmed what should have been obvious. Africans built Great Zimbabwe, but colonial governments suppressed his findings. In then Rhodesia, textbooks continue to teach that an unknown white civilization had constructed the city, because to admit the truth would be to undermine the entire premise of white supremacy. The idea that black Africans had built massive cities, developed complex political systems, and maintained international trade networks flew in the face of colonial doctrine. So they buried it. But these cities still stand. Their stones still speak. And now, so do we. Because Africa wasn't just a cradle of life. It wasn't just a continent of kings and artists. It was an epicenter of empire, powerful, literate, wealthy, and wise. A place that shaped the world before the world acknowledged it. So when we say Africa was erased from history, we're not speaking metaphorically. We mean libraries were burned, manuscripts were stolen, art was looted, and legacies were rewritten. But the truth has a way of surviving, and it's our duty to uncover it. Because when we restore Africa's past, we don't just reclaim history. We reclaim our understanding of humanity, and that changes everything. So share this story. Reclaim this truth. Because Africa was never waiting to be discovered. It was already leading. They tried to bury the truth. They burned the libraries. They looted the tombs. They renamed the kingdoms. They rewrote the textbooks. But still, the bones remember. The stones speak. The rivers run with memory. And the people we have never forgotten. Because Africa is not a footnote. It is the forward. It's not the shadow of civilization. It is the spark that lit the world. From the red sands of the Sahara to the rain-soaked highlands of Ethiopia, from the libraries of Timbuktu to the stone towers of Great Zimbabwe, from ancient cave artists to cosmic mathematicians, from bronze sculptors to gold-laden kings, Africa led, Africa taught, Africa shaped, and though they tried to erase it, the truth has never stopped breathing. It breathes through you. So ask yourself, if this is the history they tried to bury, what else are they hiding? Because reclaiming this story isn't about nostalgia. It's about power. It's about possibility. It's about knowing who we were so we can become who we're meant to be. This is not the end. This is the beginning of a new narrative, one rooted in truth, one powered by us. So if the story moved you, share it, discuss it, teach it, defend it, because no one can erase what we choose to remember. Africa was never lost. It was stolen, and now we're taking it back.